Thank you. Thanks for attending PRI's Ideas on Action conference. Thank you, Sally, for spearheading our new Free Cities Center, which we focus on practical free market and good government ideas, solutions-oriented, action-oriented. We want to actually make cities better. So I'm Steve Greenhut. I'm the director of the Free Cities Center. And our goal isn't just to point out the messy problems in our urban areas. There are plenty of them. How many stories can we write about the app that helps San Franciscoans navigate their way around the messy sidewalks, or about the $1.7 million toilet that hasn't been built in San Francisco yet. It has been in the planning stages since 2016. We want cities to be better. We want to formulate new ideas and put them into action. Today's panel on homelessness highlights that real-world, positive-oriented approach. We have three prominent speakers who are committed to addressing this frustrating humanitarian and public order problem. And to quote a certain former governor, to spur action, action, action. So before I introduce our esteemed panel, I want to raise a few just quick points that my PRI colleague, Winegarden, who was just speaking, and I made in our new book about housing and homelessness. You all have a copy of it in your bags there, and it's available complimentary on the website, Giving Housing Supply a Boost, How to Improve Affordability and Reduce Homelessness. Homelessness isn't a spending problem per se. The state spends more than $7.2 billion a year on homelessness. It amounts to $42,000 per homeless person. I mean, it's astounding. And that spending is just the tip of the iceberg when we consider the amount spent by localities and by law enforcement budgets to deal with the problem. Our state seems to measure, as others have pointed out, success by how much it spends on its problems rather than measuring the success of that spending. If we look at results, it's clear homelessness is the problem's getting worse. It's not getting better. It's not only the numbers. The number of homeless people, though, increased statewide by about 6% last year, although it varies, of course, by locality. It's also the perception and the effect on the public psyche. Right? I just drove by a homeless encampment in an overgrown lot next to the city's premier museum. On the Free City Center website, I often engage with urbanists, which, if you want to make your head spin, you should try that sometime. But they want more people to live in and enjoy our cities, which I agree with them on that. But it's hard to have vibrant, livable, and walkable cities when public parks are overrun with tents, sidewalks have become open-air drug markets, when we see all the related problems to homelessness. And it's not so much, as we argue in the book, it's not so much a spending problem as a policy problem. We're taking the wrong approach. Our state and major cities are committed to a housing first policy, you'll hear that term a lot, that prioritizes the construction of permanent housing because of the state's union work rules and all the bureaucracies and everything we're accustomed to. Come on, that toilet, if you can't build a toilet with $1.7 million in 8 years, how do we expect San Francisco to fix these major problems? And our state has the same problems. So cities such as LA spend upwards of $800,000, even sometimes more than $1 million a unit for this permanent housing. There's not enough money in the world to address that issue at that rate, a point even Jerry Brown had made. So we know we point to some more effective and practical approaches in the booklet, de-emphasizing building permanent housing through overly costly housing first programs in favor of supporting organizations like DignityMoves. And we have a video. Wayne did a video with Tim on DignityMoves that you'll find on the Free City site, and they've succeeded through temporary supportive housing. We advocate partnering with effective nonprofit organizations, and then ending the policy-created affordability crisis by revising all the overly restrictive building rules that make our housing so unaffordable. That final point warrants a little elaboration. Our booklet looks at housing and homelessness. The two issues are certainly linked. I like to say that homelessness is a mental health addiction and social problem that's greatly exacerbated by the state's lack of affordable housing. We describe some of the reasons the state has been underbuilding new housing. CEQA is always on the list. Urban growth boundaries, the California Coastal Commission, local no-growth initiatives, and the growth in building fees. So take a look at the book, and we go into that, and we try to draw the parallels where the two issues are related. But obviously, when our housing prices are so astronomical, those living on the economic margin suffer the most. Makes it harder for the poorest and most troubled residents to find any place whatsoever to live, makes it harder for nonprofits to build temporary housing. So I don't agree that homelessness is solely a housing problem, but it is partly a housing issue. So now on to our panel. Our first speaker is the Honorable Thien Ho, Sacramento County's District Attorney. He has a long career as a prosecutor. And when it comes to homelessness, he's been in the news because of his action-oriented efforts to force the city of Sacramento to do more to address the homelessness crisis. Unfortunately, Elizabeth Funk wasn't able to make it, but we have Joanne Price, who is the co-founder of DignityMoves, the Bay Area nonprofit that has had real success with its practical, scalable, and entrepreneurial approach to homelessness. Joanne has an extensive background in real estate development. And finally, you've already met him, PRI economist and senior fellow Wayne Winegarden. He's done, obviously, extensive writing and research on the topic. So let's start with D.A. Ho. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I want to talk about some statistics you may have heard. In the last 7 years, we've actually seen a 250% increase in homelessness in Sacramento. 250%. That's a greater increase than anywhere in the country during that same time period. And when we talk about homelessness, we are stuck between compassion and chaos. It's not compassionate to allow people to die on the streets. It's not compassionate for them to be assaulted on the streets. It's not compassionate for them to suffer a mental health crisis and for us to walk by and do nothing. But it's also not compassionate for those that have businesses, that have homes. And so I want to talk with you about what I did in terms of the lawsuit this last summer. In the summertime, I started to notice the increase in homelessness in the downtown area. My office is downtown. I had employees that were assaulted. I had an employee that was Muslim, and she had the traditional headwear, and somebody who was homeless started threatening her with a hate crime. I had employees that were assaulted. I had things that were broken and vandalized. I had a fire started near my office. And so I decided to write a letter to the council member for this district, Katie Valenzuela, and I asked her to fix the problem. The Superior Court judge, Judge Bowman, also wrote a letter at the same time and asked for help as well. And the mayor went on TV and he said, you know what, the DA and the judge, they're right, and we're going to fix this problem. 5 months later, nothing improved. And in the course of those months, I began to formulate a strategy in terms of my approach on this. So let's say, Steve, yes. Let's say you own private property. You allow drug dealing, human trafficking. You allow vandalism, crime to occur on your property, Steve. What would happen is the city of Sacramento will send you a letter saying, Steve, your property has created a nuisance, right, to the rest of the community. It's actually a violation of the penal code and the civil. And they'll give Steve a chance to fix the problem. And if Steve doesn't fix the problem after that, what the city would do is they'll send out a survey to the people that live around Steve's property and ask how that has affected them. And then if Steve still doesn't fix the problem, what the city would do is either they will prosecute Steve criminally or civilly sue him. And so what I decided to do was do the exact same thing to the city of Sacramento. 2 years ago, over at Fair Oaks and Howe, there was an encampment there that's in the city jurisdiction, but it borders Rich Desmond in the unincorporated part of the county, Supervisor Desmond. And Supervisor Desmond approached me and says, you know what? People here, what was happening was they were getting Amazon packages, the homeless at that location. They were going into Eatery Bakery and sexually threatening the old ladies that were baking at 3 o'clock in the morning. They were committing robberies and burglaries, sex acts, human trafficking, drug dealing. And so we threatened to sue the city, and they backed off. This time the city didn't back off, and so I was forced to sue the city. And what I found out in the process is the city of Sacramento over the last 2 years have had ordinances against sidewalk obstruction, illegal camping, storage of property. And they admitted to me in an email sent late one evening by the city attorney that over that same time period, they had not prosecuted a single one of those violations. And if you don't have enforcement of law, you're essentially going to have continued violations of the law. Sheriff Jim Cooper has gone out and actually with his homeless outreach team asked and offered services and shelter, and 8 out of 10 refuse. Same thing with the city. Because as Steve mentioned and Dr. Wayne had talked about, chronically homeless individuals, 8 out of 10 suffer from mental health and drug addiction. 8 out of 10. 9 out of 10 women who are chronically homeless for more than a year, have been sexually assaulted. So this is a public safety issue. So when people ask me, why are you doing this? Stay in your own lane. Well, public safety is my lane. It is my core mandate as the district attorney, and I will not stop until the city does what it's supposed to do, which is enforce the law. And well, in a moment, we'll talk about the 3-step process, because I actually believe, number one, we need more mental health beds. So I'm in agreement with Governor Newsom in creating those mental health beds in Proposition 1, because we need those. Number two, we need to have midterm solutions. I believe in a Haven for Hope model in San Antonio where people who are committing nonviolent offenses, instead of getting taken to jail, they are taken to this Haven for Hope location where they're assessed for services. And if they accept services and shelter and treatment, they get that. And I would dismiss the nonviolent offense in exchange for that encouragement to get the treatment. But we can't get to that midterm Haven for Hope model unless there is enforcement of the law, which Sacramento City is not doing. And so that's a 3-step process. And so right now I'm engaging in litigation with the city. We are starting discovery. They have filed a motion to dismiss. They're going to lose that. In fact, they admitted to me in private that they're going to lose that motion, and yet they say different things in public. Additionally, my office has recently filed an amicus brief, that is a friend of the court brief, on a case out of Oregon called Grants Pass. And that case basically was based on Martin versus Boise. Okay, Martin versus Boise has been misinterpreted and misused by the city of Sacramento and many other cities across the West Coast to allow our homeless crisis to become exacerbated. So what, if I still can have 1 minute here because I know.
Take your time.
So Martin versus Boise is a very interesting case. So what happened in Martin versus Boise was Boise passed a homeless ordinance that said you cannot camp anywhere at any time. And what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal, which is the court of appeal that is most overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, said was, you know what? You cannot outlaw camping in all places at all times. All places at all times, unless you have shelter. But you can have restrictions to time, place, and manner, which means you can prevent somebody from camping in a park, near a school, in the levee, or during the daytime. You can have those restrictions, but the city interprets it differently, saying you can't outlaw it all, you can't enforce the law. And I sat in my office with the mayor of Sacramento, and I asked for a daytime camping ban. You don't know this, or some people don't realize this. They outlaw camping during the day at City Hall, and they allow it at night. They outlaw it during the day because their employees were assaulted, but they won't extend that same protection to you and me. And so I asked the city to do it, and they blame me in the courts for the problem. And so Martin versus Boise, that case is now, I filed an amicus brief to have that case overturned essentially in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And they are going to hear that case this spring. And my office right now, the next 2 weeks, will file another amicus to overturn that case because it was wrongly decided. It was wrong. The reason was faulty and it was illogical. It was essentially took a bunch of different laws and combined it together into a Frankenstein new constitutional right that did not exist. And so they're wrong about it. And I'm confident that that case is going to be overturned. But I also don't want to monopolize the time, but I'm sure we'll have additional questions later. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, we thank the DA. I actually owned a building right on a park, not in this city, and it is amazing how cities will punish property owners but not be helpful for them. So this is really an amazing development here. So next we have Joanne Price, and DignityMoves is something that gives us some source of encouragement, which is something needed in this issue. So thank you.
Thank you. I think it's going to be a lively discussion here. DignityMoves, we're a Silicon Valley non-profit. We're a startup that was born out of the pandemic, because much of what I've been hearing here today is we are spending billions on this problem and nothing is happening. So put your hands up if you think that homelessness can be solved. Can. Do you think it can be solved? I love that, because that's what we came about for. We have an optimism that it can be solved. And guess what? It is a supply and demand issue. It's also a math problem. And it's also a policy issue. So, in California, there's about 180,000 people homeless. And of those people who are homeless, 115,000 are unsheltered. That's the visible homelessness you can see, and that's affecting business and the economy, etc. But what happens is, if we put that's about 70%. And when you look at the countrywide, 50% of the unsheltered population is living here in California. However, if I'm in policy, in order to move that person out of homelessness, they have to move into a permanent housing unit. And that's what we get marked on. Hey, you reduced your homelessness because you've moved X number into permanent housing. But if permanent housing is now topping $1 million, an affordable housing unit to build in Silicon Valley. And for every person we're housing, 2 to 3, if not 4 people are falling back into homelessness. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out what's going to happen, and happen quickly. So we have to stem the flow. And if it's a math problem, why are we waiting 5, 7 years to put someone up in a permanent housing project, which is funded by the feds, by the way? And that's an important point, because it's not coming out of the state budget. When we move people off our homelessness register and then into permanent housing, funded by a Section 8 voucher, it's funded by the feds, not from the state. But we can't wait 5 years to build permanent housing. So if we all think back, for those of us who went to college and we're in our little dorms and we're sharing a housing unit, we done so, and it was great. We fostered community spirit, and we done so because that was the only thing we could afford at the time. And then we graduated, maybe we could share a house with just 2 of us, and it was easier. And then we got married, and then we got a house, blah, blah, blah. But today, we need to address the problem, and we need to address it today. We can't even wait 2, 3 years. And that's something that is happening, and it's done well in the state. It's Newsom's Home Key program. That's the only thing that's happened in the last decade or more where it's facilitated the production of housing quickly. We've got like 16,000 units that have come online in a record amount of time. And that was where DignityMoves, kind of the haha moment went on. It's like, why are we buying all these hotels that are like 20, 30, 40 years old? They're decrepit. They have to have then a bunch of money put into them to renovate them. They're not really suitable for this type of housing, what we call interim housing, because everyone's just like given a key and locked in their room and hidden away. We need to create more housing. We need to add to the stock. So in round 1, we scratched our heads. It was like, hey, we can build, we can apply for Home Key. We meet that criteria, and we can cost a fraction of what the hotels were costing. So that's how we were born. We were the only project in round 1 as modular construction. It was so successful that in the second round, there were 16. We became the catalyst for 16 other projects in round 2. And in round 3, there's even more. Why? Because it's cost-effective housing, and we're building housing at $200,000 a door, not $1 million. And we're building it in less than 12 months. That's the criteria of Home Key. So we exist not only as a real estate developer, and I know there's plenty of real estate developers in the room, but we're also there to kind of put our hands up and present this solution, interim solution, and that it can work, because the longer we leave people on the streets, it's costing us as a society twice as much. So don't think that for one moment it's costing us nothing, keeping the encampment open, but all those visits to the ER room and the fire and the police, that's costing in excess of $60,000 per year per person for a chronically homeless individual. And I can cite data from 2019, so almost 4 years old now, that the cost for a person experiencing homelessness on the ER, the healthcare system, was $48,000 per person. To put them in interim housing, it's about $100 per bed per night. And typically in interim housing, you're staying for about 4, 5, 6 months, so that bed is turning over at least twice a year. Because when you think about it, someone living on the street, they're not thinking about work or like, hey, let's go to school. They're thinking about, how am I going to survive? How am I going to be safe? If I'm a woman, I'm going to be 3 times more likely to get sexually assaulted. And where am I charging my phone and what am I eating tonight? When we build solutions such as the DignityMoves model, what we do is we're creating a safe environment, and within a radius of that site, we are enacting a no camping, no sleeping ordinance. For example, in Rona Park, we built a site. Within 500 feet of that site, we enacted a no sleeping ordinance, so nobody could sleep there. If you were caught sleeping, you would be moved on. And this is not too dissimilar to what they're doing in Los Angeles. So the Judge Carter ruling, I don't know if any of you have been following that, but there was a big LA alliance and they said, look, something needs to happen here. We need to reclaim the streets. We need to bring people indoors because it's the right, humane thing to do. And in a nutshell, what they found was it's about 60% of people will come indoors. And people will refuse the bed, the shelter, if it's in if it's in a congregate warehouse. So imagine like that stigmatized homeless shelter, a room like this, full of bunk beds. Who wants to live in that? We build solutions where everybody gets their own private door. It's about 70 square feet. They can lock it. They can come and go as they please. Their possessions are going to be safe each and every night. And to that, we have not had anybody refuse shelter. And the cost to run that is about $36,000 per bed for the whole year. And what that also means is shelter housing is healthcare. People with severe mental illness, if they're on the streets, yes, everybody can feel unsafe because they're not getting the right resources. They can't effectively access those resources. And they're wandering about looking for places to eat and stay warm and stay dry. So if we take all those vacant pieces of property, developers, if you have land, like I'm using in Silicon Valley, John Sabrato, a prolific developer, he has a site going through entitlements, and he's offered that site, it's 3 acres, to the city of San Jose for $1 per year for us to build interim housing that will stay in place from 5 to 10 years. And the cost of that unit is $80,000 on a grass lot site, and the cost over that 10 years is going to serve at least 3,000 people. And when you consider the unsheltered population of San Jose is 4,300, it's going to make a significant impact on visible homelessness in San Jose. Is that a good one?
Okay, thank you, Joanne. And now, Wayne Winegarden. Wayne? You got that going. There you go.
Okay, I have to say, just to dwell on DignityMoves for a second, because Tim and I, and if you haven't seen the video, it's on YouTube, and I really recommend kind of going on and seeing that, because it really is, unless you've seen the place, it's hard to imagine how much good it's actually doing. The fact that you can spend $50,000 and provide a place that's clean, that's safe, that people want to go to, as opposed to spending, again, $800,000, you're spending $50,000. And I think really importantly, you're also dealing with the support services as well. And and there's lots of ways that you can actually kind of work this so that you can focus on the actual reason that someone fell into homelessness, and most importantly, why someone's still in homeless. And one of the things that Elizabeth said to me that just stuck with me, because you have people falling into homelessness for economic reasons too. I'm an economist, to hammer everything's a nail, right? But this is San Francisco's housing prices over time. And this is something that Stephen and I put in our book. And I made the chart just because I thought it was just a fun chart. And it's also kind of fun to just kind of reminisce that back in 1970, I think this is the oldest thing I've ever said, right? Back in 1970, right, you could buy a house for $28,000 in San Francisco. I mean, think about that, $28,000. You can't buy a car for $28,000. You could buy a flat in San Francisco for $28,000. If you adjust for inflation, and that's not the only thing you adjust for, but if you adjust for inflation, that's $227,000. The actual cost of an average home in San Francisco is $1.4 million. Something has gone wrong with our housing market. And that is inextricably linked with all sorts of things, everything that Stephen was talking about, that Elizabeth was talking about, that the DA was talking about. All of these things are interrelated. It's hard to separate out. But to say that basic supply and demand, and I'm not going to go through this because you've been told all of the different reasons again, so there's no reason to dwell on them. But just the fact that we mandate so many burdens that you just can't build quickly enough and you just can't build cheaply enough to suffice to the demand. One thing they didn't say, which I thought, just to put a little kind of exclamation point on this issue, is that for 30, 40 years, we've been underbuilding by about 110,000 units annually. And that is just terrifying. So when you're talking about the homelessness issues, you're talking about that multifaceted kind of problem of, one, affordability. We're just throwing people out in the streets. And then, two, you're talking about Martin versus Boyd, which is being misinterpreted. I learned that. I didn't realize there was that interpretation of it, but that is being, so we need to address that. We need to address Prop 47, which feels completely unrelated, but when Stephen Hilton's doing that, that's incredibly valuable, because if I can steal $950, right, I can maintain a destructive lifestyle. Right? If I'm dealing with addiction, I'm not thinking rationally, but I know I can get my next fix. So you need to, in economics, it's all about incentives, right? And so you need to apply the right incentives to the right situation. Right now, we're giving positive incentives for bad behavior, right? That I have a right to stay on the street, and then I have a right to steal to fund a destructive lifestyle. Well, if that's what we're incenting, we really shouldn't be surprised with the outcome. What we need to be doing is disincenting that lifestyle, and part of that is in repealing laws like Prop 47 that allow people to kind of perpetuate. But something, and this is what I was saying, I got on a tangent, I apologize, something Elizabeth said to me that really kind of stuck with me. Because we know, we look at surveys, most people are homeless, who are homeless are suffering with addiction, mental illness, those types of things. We also know that economics and lack of affordability is a prime driver. Well, she told me the story of this woman, and I think it's actually apropos of what a lot of people are experiencing. She had never done drugs before in her life. She was not a drug addict. Okay? But after the first night of trying to get through living on the streets, and she was so terrified of being assaulted that she forced herself to stay up. But staying up all night is really hard. The first thing she did the next day is went out and looked for drugs. The drugs said they keep her awake, and eventually the drug addiction ensued. The bottom line is that whether or not you become homeless for whatever reason, being on the streets, living on the street, that's not an acceptable lifestyle, and the costs, and which is what I think the DA was talking about as well, the costs are so high on a human perspective in terms of addiction, mental health problems, that I think she said it's about 30 days, that once someone's been on the street for 30 days, that things just kind of get out of control. And that, I think, is something that's so important about Dignity Moves, was that nobody has ever denied the housing. Because when you look at the video, you see it. It's clean housing with showers and all the facilities you need, and it's safe. Right? Women don't go to shelters because they get assaulted at shelters. If I have a door that I can lock, I'm not going to get assaulted. If I have my own room, my dog or my cat, which when you're homeless, that's your family, they can live with you in these shelters. So it was just incredibly moving. And for me, it's an amazing private sector solution, innovative thinking that, well, we don't need to build an $800,000 house, that we can do this more cost effectively. We can be compassionate, but we can do better with less. And that's exactly what it is. We can get people the support services that they need. And so I don't know if you can see this chart. It's from our book, and I was hoping it'd be easier to see. There's no way in the world that anybody in the back can see it, so please don't even try. And I'll say, so what we had back in 2007, about, let's say, 140,000 people were homeless, both sheltered and unsheltered. And I think we forget, and I think this is where kind of all these reforms matter. Homelessness was declining for many years. Up until 2014, homelessness in the state was going down, and it was going down at a faster rate than anywhere else in the country. Kind of the California dream, right? We can be optimistic. We know how to do this. It's almost like we've forgotten how to run a state, forgotten how to run a city. Homelessness was going down for many, many years at a faster rate than anywhere else in the country. And then something happened. Now, one of the things that happened is Martin versus Boise around this time. It's a deep reinterpretation of having a right to camp on the street. But another thing that happened is housing first. And I think that we can't separate out that concept. And it was a good concept, perhaps. It made sense in some ways, but it's not working. Unless you're going to make the argument that this crisis, we're now up to 181,000 more homeless people than ever. And the population is going down too, right? So more homeless people than ever. Unless you're going to make the argument that it would be worse if not for housing first, which seems a bit ridiculous. Housing first, our current approach is just not working. So I want to spend a little bit of time for you to understand what we're trying to do right now, why it's so ineffective, because we need to do different things. We need to experiment. Maybe someone's going to come up with a better idea, sorry, but maybe they will. And that's what we want. We want private organizations working, experimenting, figuring out ways that we can address this problem. The problem with housing first, the whole idea, and there is something sensible, especially if you're just homeless for economic reasons, is that if I can get somebody into a home in that stable platform, right, living in a home, and the security that provides, that's a much better platform for me to help that person, right? And there's logic to that, right? I mean, if you're secure in an apartment and you're not living on the streets, you have an address so you can get mail. I mean, that was one of the things that you talk about. How do you get a job when you don't have an address and get mail? So if I have somebody in a home, we can address that. The problem is twofold. One, for the economic homeless, whatever that number is, 5% or 95%, doesn't matter. For that percentage of the population, it's too costly. We're just throwing too much money at the problem. At $700,000 is about the average. In LA, it's $1 million. Whatever the number, we don't have the resources to build everybody a home. And when you hear politicians say that, they're lying to you. I know it's shocking, but they're lying to you. Okay, that we cannot afford to build everyone a home. The other problem, though, and the surveys do show the majority of people who are homeless have mental illness, have addiction issues, is that treatment never comes. It never comes effectively. In the hotels, when somebody's in that room by themselves, with Project Home Key, Project Room Key, one of the problems that we've seen is that they're doing drugs in the rooms, that there's no control. They're not seeking treatment. They're just kind of there for a while. The property gets degraded. They damage things, and then they leave and they're back on the streets. And so you've seen that kind of cycling with housing first, is that you're not actually getting to the most important part. You're not getting to kind of that treatment, that next step of how do we get somebody onto that better path. And there's lots of ways, there's lots of good examples. Actually, Kerry Jackson and I have done a lot of research looking at some of these, using police as gateways to get people to the, get them to know where help is, family, reuniting people with family. There's lots of different strategies that can be applied to lots of different people's situations, but we have to start thinking about that. And one of the things I think that just shows the ineffectiveness of housing first, and it was used in Canada, and Stephen and I put this in the book, that they did a test in Canada, and they had two groups. It was over 2 years, right? 24 months, 2 years. One group received housing first, and one group they did nothing. There was no program for them. And the outcomes in the housing first was actually worse. So you were better off just doing nothing than doing housing first. The amount of drug addictions was higher, the mortality rates were higher. I mean, there was just, on almost every metric, doing housing first made the situation worse, not better. And so the bottom line is that we need to actually do something different. And I think this is my favorite quote from President Obama. So I always bring this up in this kind of instance because I love being able to invoke his name positively. But what he said is the private and philanthropic sectors are responsible for some of the best thinking, innovation, and evidence-based approaches to ending homelessness. And to me, that's just shocking, but that's 100% correct. And there's so many different groups that we at PRI have interacted with. Father Joe's Villages down in San Diego that have just done a fantastic job of actually helping people addressing those root causes of the homelessness crisis. And so lower cost housing, temporary shelters, other types of housing that doesn't have to hit that housing first, permanent housing. That's got to be our mantra in terms of getting people off of the streets. And getting people off the streets has to be the priority. That's not, it's no way to run a city. Right? It's not fair to the homeless. It's not fair to the citizens. Not fair to businesses. You're acting, in San Francisco, people don't come there for conventions anymore. And there's a reason for it. I mean, we were walking around and you go down by the Embarcadero, you turn right and all you see are empty storefronts. I mean, they've just left, and for good reason. Right? When you're losing $950 per day per person stealing, it's hard to stay in business. So, we've got to clear the streets, and we've got to clear the streets economically, so you've got to do that with the more efficient temporary shelters, other low-cost alternatives. And then the savings you generate that from that, as opposed to spending $700,000 in 3 years to build a housing, you can now use those savings to actually provide treatment. One of the things that Carrie and I had researched, and this is many years ago now, but they were spending $121 million, right? $121 million a year cleaning the streets. Okay? Now, that's money that's better spent giving people treatment than cleaning up after the problem. And that's the kind of the approach that we need to start looking at. Something else that we haven't mentioned, which is somewhat similar to is homeless courts. And this is just it's something we're beginning to do, and we need to do it more often. But we need to use both positive incentives and negative incentives to address the problem. From a negative incentive, when someone commits a crime and they're homeless, that's an opportunity. And we need to take that opportunity to, in effect, sentence them to treatment, which is what we were talking about. That the homeless court says, we'll expunge your record afterwards, particularly only if it's nonviolent, of course, but we'll expunge your record afterwards. However, instead of going to jail, you're going to be sentenced to the treatment. If you successfully complete it, get somebody, the goal is to get somebody kind of back into a stable path, back to kind of being productive parts, having a whole fulfilling life. And again, it's using that negative interaction as an opportunity to address the problem. We also need to then use positive interactions. In Virginia, there's several organizations, and they use day rooms as a means to provide place to plug in a phone, place to take a shower, kind of rest for a little bit outside of the elements. But the day room creates a positive incentive for interaction, where it's like, okay, now that somebody's in the day room, as opposed to just kind of giving them the services, you also figure out how can we help you kind of get back. What help do you need in getting that help and getting that help efficiently? So there's all sorts of kind of negative and positive incentives we need to be using, but we need to be kind of using that type of innovative approach, ideally with private sector firms or private sector charities. They've shown themselves to be more effective and more cost effective, so that the cost for the state will be less, especially compared to housing first, but the outcomes are going to be a lot better. And then something that we just cannot underappreciate is housing affordability. Right? That we absolutely need to address that problem, because one thing we have in this state that's different from all other states, if you are on the edge, right, and life events happen, whether it's medical, health, job loss, car crash, whatever the case may be, because of how costly it is to live in this state, right, it doesn't take very many life events to push you over. Back in Virginia, where I used to live, right, it's really cheap to live there. You can maybe weather those types of storms that you can't weather here. So we need to address not just housing affordability, but energy affordability, just total cost of living. But if we take that private-driven kind of approach, we can address this problem. And I think the numbers show that we used to be able to. We just need to get back to that.